Okay, so we're looking at, so today we're looking at training the muscular system. So we're going to look at all parts of that when it comes to training it, right? Obviously, there's the strength training portion of it, which is sort of probably what popped into your head immediately. But we're also going to talk about like, how to train for flexibility, which is a big part of, training this whole system. So we want to be able to understand like the concept of developing strength and power, right? So there is like a physiologic difference between training for like aerobic power, like, giving yourself like an aerobic engine that can get you like to produce energy throughout a whole workout. But there's also like a difference between like, muscular strength, right? And so we want to kind of really get the differences between those two outlined. And then we want to know the difference between like our contractions. So we're going to do a quick review of that again. And then the different methods that we use to measure strength. Primarily, we're going to focus on really only one of them, but we'll look at some of these really fun other methods that are out there. If you ever end up working in like a lab or something like that, where you have this really cool, strength training stuff. Different resistance training methods, so like systems and things like that, how your nervous system adapts to that. And then we will talk a little bit about like the difference between like hypertrophy and hyperplasia, although I'm probably going to move through that pretty quick because it's not something that really needs that much discussing. And then we'll talk about like muscle soreness and how that works as well. So if we're looking at like developing muscular strength, right? So like first we need to kind of define like what we mean by strength. So like muscular strength, if we give it its own definition, is going to be the amount of force that muscles can exert against a resistance, right? And we've used the word strength, we've used the term strength before, but like, it is the amount of internal tensions that the muscles can generate in order to overcome external forces, right? If we're talking about it, that's really what your muscle's job is, right? Is to generate internal tension in order to kind of move something around, right? So obviously there's a lot of things that can like affect this, right? We know that like how well we synthesize contractile proteins, right? How often we make new actin and myosin fibers, that's going to play a big role when it comes to strength. Your muscle fiber type, so depending on like how you metabolize like energy, are you better at glycolysis or are you better at aerobic metabolism, Gender differences is going to be a big one. This is a fun one that I always like to talk about because I actually have a really great example of this, but point of tendon insertion is actually a big one. Like if you look at my bicep, you can tell I'm meant to be like a long, lanky person, but like have done like a lot of weight training because you can actually see, like, look at how large a gap there is like between my bicep tendon and like the rest of my forearm. Like that's like a developed bicep over time, but you can see like this super long tendon. And so what that does, that actually kind of indicates like a lack of power. When your tendons tend to go like a little bit further, like to the ends of your joints, they're not quite as long. And so they tend to be a little stiffer. And that stiffer allows that muscle to exert more force. So you can kind of see like that's a big part of like the genetics that make up you based on like how your body is kind of shaped. One of my fun ones. And then we get neurologic activation. This is arguably one of the most important. Understanding like how your nervous system actually controls your muscle will have a lot of impact on your strength. And then obviously hormonal factors as well. Like you're going to be much better at developing muscle fibers if you have, the types of hormones that help you develop muscle fibers, namely testosterone. So, lots of factors that kind of come into this. But if we're looking at like the ideas of strength, we do have to kind of review our muscular contractions, right? So a contraction is going to be, when the proteins within your muscles are, binding or holding in one position or like unbinding, right? And so muscular contractions that we've got three types, right? Muscular contractions. Three types. We are going to see concentric contractions, right? Those are contractions that are occurring when a muscle is shortening, right? So like when a muscle is generating more force than a resistance, it's going to overcome that resistive force, and therefore the muscle is going to shorten, right? So the muscle generates greater, greater oh my God, internal tension. Well, I can't type today. Than a resistive force, right? So your muscle shortens, right? Or we can think of this as like force production, right? Like when your muscle is generating force, that's a concentric contraction. And this is also going to be when we are labeling like tempos for training. So when we're looking at like the tempo, it is going to be like, let's say we're looking at a 4-2-1 tempo, right? The 1 is going to be the concentric portion. So it is the final number. So when we're describing that 4-2-1 tempo, we're talking about like 4 seconds eccentric, 2 seconds isometric, and 1 second concentric. So that's how long this part of the lift should be taking. If it was a 2-0-2 tempo and it looks something like this, that would be like, that would be 2 seconds up and 2 seconds down with no pause in between, right? So what works? I guess I'll put like another example of that. 4, 2. There we go. So that's going to be our concentric muscle contractions. And we just label it like that because like we have to have it somewhere, like the one thing that sometimes confuses people when we're talking about like muscular contractions and you're talking about like lifting tempos is they'll picture like, they're like, oh, this goes in order of the lift, right? So like, let's say this was 4-2-1, right? And like, let's say I was doing like a bicep curl. A lot of people make the mistake of being like, oh, it goes, first number, second number, third number. If I had a dumbbell in my hand, it would be like first number, the pause in between would be second number, third number would be on the way down. But that's not how it works, right? These are describing like concentric eccentric has nothing to do with direction. It has everything to do with whether the muscle is shortening or lengthening, right? Shortening, that's concentric. Lengthening, that's eccentric. So we always put it in the order when we're describing tempo as eccentric first, isometric second, concentric third. So that's why a 4-2-1 tempo wouldn't be, 4 seconds up, 2 seconds pause, 1 second down. It would be 1 second up, 2 second pause, 4 seconds down. Whoops. So that is what we're going to see there. Generally people tend to put a lot of emphasis on concentric contractions. I think that's what people think of when they think of lifting, because the concentric part is, I guess ostensibly is the hardest part, like that's the hardest part of like working out is like you overcoming the force. And so like, that's where you tend to put the most grit in and kind of work to overcome that force. And so like, people tend to think that that is what working out is, because working out is, hard and supposed to be challenging. And so I think that that's like, a really common misconception. Like we're developing strength so that we continually like overcome stuff. But, you'll see people do these lifts where they'll like work really hard and they'll get that bicep curl and then they'll just drop those dumbbells and then they'll like do the next one and then they'll just drop it, and they're not putting any emphasis on eccentric strength. But eccentric strength is incredibly important. So let's go ahead and look at eccentric strength here, right? Let's look at the lengthening of our muscles. So eccentric contractions are contractions that are occurring when a muscle is lengthening, right? So the muscle generates less internal tension than a resistive force, right? The muscle lengthens. We can think of this as force reduction, right? You're reducing force. And if we're looking at like tempo, as we label it, it would be that first number. right? We always label it eccentric. Eccentric is always the first number in a tempo lift. For the record, sometimes you will see occasion, and NASM doesn't take this approach, but just talking about like labeling tempos and stuff. Sometimes you'll see 4 numbers listed here. They'll put both sides of the concentric. That's not true. They'll put both sides of the isometric. So like, you know, there's technically like the pause in between reps that's taking place. Like if I look at like a bicep curl, right, and I do that 4-2-1 tempo, it would be 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I would just lift again. But if you wanted to like give somebody a second to pause in between reps, you could say like, let's say it's a 4-2-1-2 tempo. Sometimes you'll see people label it like that, and that would be 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2 again, and then 1, and then you would reset. But sometimes you'll see that. NASM doesn't do that. The isometric portion is the portion under tension when the muscle is not in its resting position. So, so this is one thing that we need to know about eccentric contractions. Eccentric contractions are heavily associated with that delayed onset muscle soreness. So delayed onset muscle soreness, more commonly referred to as DOMS, is a gradual discomfort or inflammation that occurs between 24 and 48 hours after a workout. And then the reason we're talking about this here is DOMS is heavily associated with eccentric contractions. So this is one of the reasons why like we do want to have like I've said this before, but like the stabilization phase of training doesn't get enough credit for being great at hypertrophy. It really is pretty good at hypertrophy, you know, because it does involve like these really long eccentric contractions, and those eccentric contractions result in like a lot of, you know, inflammation, which results in like a lot of muscle size. Typically, the types of workouts that make you the most sore are usually hypertrophy style workouts. Like if you've ever done like max strength training where you're lifting at like a super high percentage of your 1 rep max, there's not a lot of you know, there's not a lot of soreness the next day. You'll be like, your joints will be a little stiff, like, because your tendons were doing so much work to deal with all that tension. So you'll get like a little bit of like stiffness in your joints, but like when it comes to like the full belly of the muscle being sore, that is most commonly going to be associated with hypertrophy. Because again, like what's happening there is you are experiencing like inflammation in those muscles, and now your body's going to come along and like fix those. In fact, we're going to kind of look at that here in just a second when we get back to hypertrophy here in a little bit. But finishing up here, our muscle actions, we do have isometric contractions next. And isometric contractions are contractions that are occurring when a muscle is remaining at a constant length. Right? So if your muscle cannot generate enough force to overcome something, or if it's generating enough force to keep something stable, that's an isometric contraction, right? The muscle generates equal internal tension to a resistive force, right? So your muscle stabilizes. Or we can think of it as like, actually, I guess that would be force stabilization. So your muscle stays constant. And when we're looking at tempo here, this is that middle number. Right, so 202, 421, the middle number. Underline that and underline that. So that is our isometric contraction, right? It doesn't shorten, it doesn't lengthen. So isometric exercises are kind of cool, but the one thing about them is that like they massively increase your blood pressure. Like we like isometric contractions. Don't get me wrong; like they're a very important part of lifting, especially because like stabilization is such an important concept that you want to maintain while you're exercising. You don't want your joints to be unstable, but it does result in super high blood pressure. So if you have a client who already has high blood pressure, generally you're going to want to avoid isometrics. So isometric exercises dramatically increase blood pressure due to the amount of internal tension they are generating. Because basically, in order to have like a good isometric contraction, you kind of have to be pulling on both sides of the joint simultaneously. Like you're pulling this much, but you're also pulling this much over here, and that creates like tension in both directions. So it's twice as much tension as you would normally be like generating tension on one side and relaxing tension on the other. You know, that's something that if you have a client with like high blood pressure, you want to take the isometrics out. Like if I had a client who had high blood pressure and they were in stabilization, I would do a 4-0-1 tempo. That would be a really good way, or just keep them using like the classic 2-0-2. Increase to the amount of tension they are generating. Therefore, should be avoided in clients with high blood pressure. Okay, so there's kind of some really cool ways that we can measure this actually. Now, this is one that is not super common, but you'll see it sometimes. And so you can measure someone's strength by using what is called a cable tensiometer. And tensiometers are really cool. There's this little thing right here, and you'll notice like the line goes through this little pivot point up and over this and through another pivot point here. So depending on how hard you pull on this, it will pull through these little cables here, and this will experience like how much tension you're generating. So what you do is you have your client like, you know, take themselves out to like a specific range of motion, and then they would hold that there isometrically for 5 to 10 seconds. And then like that would tell you how much tension that muscle can generate. And it's kind of cool. Like this is something you'll see in like physical therapy clinics every now and then. If you're having trouble like activating a muscle, you know, a cable tensiometer can kind of show you, oh, this muscle is clearly not firing the way it's supposed to. So let's say you had your client like raise their arm up like this and they're, you know, losing tension, or they're not generating much tension, you'll notice they'll start to do something kind of like this in order to like make up for it. And it's like, yeah, your deltoid is not doing as much work as it's supposed to, so other muscles are coming in to try to take over. You can also see like dynamometers. This is basically the same exact thing, but it only works really in your forearms. I mean, I guess theoretically you could do this in other muscles that can like, you know, sort of pull from one spot to another. But basically a dynamometer is like a grip tester. And so somebody would actually squeeze with their grip here. I'm proud to say that my great grandfather, I remember I got to go with him to one doctor's appointment because we were visiting him that day and my mom was taking him to the doctors. And, you know, he was, you know, older than time at that point. But like he went in there and just crushed the doctor's hand. And the doctor was like, good God, man. My grandpa was like 89 years old at that point. And he was like, you have the grip of a 20-year-old. And he was like, oh, well, you know, and he was kind of out of it at that point. But I, you know, I always thought, I was like, that's really cool. And one of the reasons this is really interesting is because grip strength has been directly related to long life. One thing that we have found is that there is a direct correlation between like how good your grip is and how long people tend to live. And part of the reason that they think that is just because of like blood pressure control. You know, if you have a really good grip, you're not like holding pressure in your extremities, and it also shows that you are like, you know, keeping up on like your strength development and stuff. And so like, I don't necessarily think there's anything special about grip, but I do think there is something special about being strong into your elder years. So that's kind of a fun one. Now, that picture should not be on here. That's weird. That photo is totally not associated with that slide. And I goofed up the slide by closing it. So the one that we're going to most commonly use when we're talking about like measuring strength, the one that's like very applicable to us is going to be a percentage of the 1 repetition max. So this becomes really important for today's lesson because we are talking a lot about like developing strength, and knowing what your client's 1 repetition max is an important part of making sure that your workouts are hard enough, right? Yesterday we talked about the principle of overload. If you're going to apply that overload effectively, you need to work at a high percentage of 1 rep max. So measuring strength, you know, one of the most common versions of that is going to be the 1 repetition max. And that's going to be a measurement of the maximal weight a person can lift in a single repetition of exercise. So this is great, right? Like we love our percent of 1 rep max because like it does allow us to have perspective on how strong somebody is, right? Oh, that's weird. What the? A measurement of the maximum weight a person can lift in a single repetition. Yeah, there you go. I don't know what was going on with that sentence. So we can use this. This is an excellent tool in applying progressive overload for a client, right? If we're talking about like, you know, the principle of overload, and we're talking about progressive overload, how do you continue to make things like more challenging for your client? Well, one of the best ways to do that is by working at like the proper percentage of 1 rep max, right? So obviously this can be dangerous. Like if somebody's trying to test this without supervision, like if they don't know how to do it properly. So you do need to be careful with that. If you are trying to find out your own 1 repetition maximum, I would say use I would work at a higher number of repetitions and then use like a conversion calculator. That's a much safer way to do it because then you'll be lifting at a lower intensity, which means you know, you're more likely to understand like where your sticking point is, quote unquote, right? At that point where you're like, I'm good. Oh no. Like that way it's not going back up one more time. So it can be like a really excellent tool there. And so typically trainers will assign exercise intensities using a percentage of 1 repetition maximum. Okay, so the goal of that, the reason for that is that, like, again, it does apply progressive overload. You are ensuring that you're making the muscles work as hard as they are able. And the other part of it is like, you can use that working as hard as they are able while also getting them to land in specifically whatever energy system you want them to, right? So like if I want you to develop maximal strength, well, I want to primarily train in that immediate energy system, right? That ATP-PC phosphagen system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you lift at a really low number of repetitions, which means I need to have you lift at a very high percentage of your 1 rep max. Now, when it comes to like developing strength, like if we're trying to develop it, right, we've got isometric training, which is a really effective way at gaining strength. However, it's not so good for like hypertrophy. There's just not a lot of like movement that's occurring. And so because of that, this tends to not be very effective at creating like new muscular proteins. It makes your body very good at like stabilizing. So if we're like training to develop strength, there's a couple, you know, we got a lot of different methods out there. Training to develop strength. One of the most common versions is isometric training. If you've ever done planks, you're doing isometric training, right? But it's basically training that involves sustained contractions of a muscle group for a designated period of time. So it's nice, you know. Typically, like when you're doing this, like really the only goal is to like get better at that specific range of motion. Then we've got sort of our most common version. This is sort of what we tend to think of when we think of like, you know, training to develop strength, but there's progressive resistance exercise. This is your classic like working out, right? It's like, okay, get to the gym, do 10 repetitions at 100 pounds. Awesome. All right, you're stronger now. Let's go back and do 10 repetitions again, but let's do it at 105 pounds. Awesome. You did great. Cool. Next time I see you, we're going to do 10 repetitions again, but we are going to do it at 110 pounds, right? That's progressive resistance training. And literally, we're just focusing on progressive overload, right? So that is a method of increasing the ability of muscles to generate force, right? And so like the idea here is like continue progression of the amount of resistance a client can lift for each specific exercise. We are literally going to make it harder. That makes your muscles larger, it makes them stronger, and obviously it makes them like less prone to injury, which is really great. So that's progressive resistance training. It's like, okay, we do Monday and it's like, it's a certain amount of weight for this exercise. Next week on Monday, we're going to do the same exercise, but we're going to do more weight. Now, there is also variable resistance training. This is not going to be super common for most of us, but variable resistance training, kind of a unique one here. It's actually using a special machine that varies the amount of resistance through a specific range of motion. And so the idea there is that it's helping you achieve like maximal tension in a specific spot. So this is performed on a special machine in which the resistance varies throughout the range of motion. Okay, another good example of variable resistance training actually are things like, actually, hold on, go back, I'm skipping forward. Resistance bands are actually a really good example of this. That's not a special machine or anything, but resistance bands can be an example of this because at the end range of motion, the resistance increases substantially, right? So like if you've ever been using resistance bands, obviously they gain more tension the further you kind of stretch them out. And then there's always that moment at the very end where it's like, yeah, that's not going any further. You know, this thing's about to snap in half. That's a good example of variable resistance training. Now, I've only done this once, but it is shockingly difficult. But has anybody ever done like barbell squats or deadlifts or bench pressing? You know, it's almost, it has pretty much has to be barbells. I mean, unless you're a crazy person with chains attached to them. Have you guys ever tried that? No, it's brutal. Let me pull up a.
Yeah.
Have you tried it?
No, I've never tried it, but I've seen where people do it, like on YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Dude, so hard. So that's an example of variable resistance training. I'm looking for a video that is not 3 minutes longer. Come on.
And I've also seen, like, if they don't use chains, they use like bands and they attach them to like the floor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what's cool about that is like, obviously the further you go through the range of motion, the more challenging it gets. That's an example of variable resistance training. Like the tension increases as you go through a further range of motion. All right, I'm just gonna click this one. I'm gonna mute it and keep talking over it. So like, you know, the further they push, right? Like the further he presses away, there's more and more and more tension. The same thing is true, like you said, of bands. And that's a really great way actually to kind of work on like particularly maximum strength lifts or plyometrics. This type of like variable resistance training has been really good to kind of plateau bust, especially at the end of like a big cycle. The way a lot of people will use this is like they'll be on like a big powerlifting split, and before they will do like a deload, which means to like lower your intensity for a couple weeks in order to like give your body time to recover and, you know, give it a new training stimulus and kind of reset everything. This is really great to do at like your peak right before you do that reload. Because what that does is that sends like a signal that like you are having trouble overcoming this resistive force. And so your body goes, man, I really need to get stronger. And so it gives it a little bit of time to adapt while you're in the middle of your deload week. So that's variable resistance training. Now we've also got isokinetic training. This is probably something, this is kind of, honestly, it's going out of style. It's still used in like injury, like physical therapist offices and stuff, but isokinetic training is really kind of interesting. This requires a very special machine, but it requires a special machine that keeps the muscle contracting at a constant pace. So what's really cool about like isokinetic training is you'll get on this machine here. I'll pull this up actually. Isokinetic training. So it's this very interesting like machine that actually makes the contractions occur like very specifically. Oh, is this going to be? No, that's not what I want. Come on. Oh, I guess we could use that. I mean, this is not quite what I'm looking for because this is not really the right area, but he's only got his quad working here. But basically, he's strapped into this so he can't use his body. And that machine is only allowing him to like move so fast. And it can actually create resistance in both directions. So what's cool is the machine, he's doing like a leg extension, and then he's also doing like a hamstring curl. And so it's a great way to like, you know, enhance like to get yourself to come back from like an injury, because a lot of times when you have like an injury, you know, your body is sort of forgetting how to use that muscle in the proper direction. So a lot of times you'll have like resistance up and then you'll just drop it, right? Isokinetic training can kind of get that to not to happen. It's commonly used in like rehab, but honestly, we're probably not going to see it that often. Then we got plyometrics. Raph, we were talking about this yesterday, right? Plyometric training, which is going to be explosive training methods that work on rate of force production of muscles. Now, this is one, I always love talking about this because plyometric training is really great. It actually toughens your body. You know, this actually makes like harder tissue, which is a good thing because that is now more resistant to damage because of like how it has sort of contracted. Like particularly your tendons have to deal with this crazy amount of tension, you know, during landings. And so it actually makes them tougher and more resistant to damage. And it does this through using those stretch reflexes that we've talked about in the past, right? So, you know, this is going to enhances muscle strength and power production through that myotactic reflex, right? Right, which is basically like a stretch shortening cycle. You know, you're rapidly eccentrically lengthening a muscle, right? We're going back to that like eccentric contraction, right? If you were to do it super, super fast, your nervous system is going to go, whoa, you know, if we lengthen too much, we're going to tear in half. And so what it does is it contracts in the opposite direction. This can be a really great way to keep you from overstretching your muscles because it can actually enhance your nervous system's ability to kind of work against that. So there is an inherent neuromuscular response that happens in order to protect your muscles from being able to overstretch. Neuro response in order to prevent muscles from being overstretched or injured, right? So that's actually what's so cool about that. I love that one. here's a really good example, right? So he's starting, like he's gonna rapidly eccentrically descend into the bottom of his squat. That's gonna create a stretch reflex, which will allow him to be extra powerful as he jumps. He's gonna land again, which is gonna be another rapid eccentric lengthening, which will allow him to again jump. And then there's gonna be the greatest amount of force coming from high to low. There's gonna be a really, really big eccentric contraction happening as he lands on the floor here, while his glutes and hamstrings and quads, like while those muscles lengthen out. And that's going to create a big rebound at the end here where he'll do a maximal strength jump. So, you know, this is sort of a small jump. This is sort of a small jump. And then this one from here to here, that's going to be a maximum effort jump. And you can see here, these numbers that they're using in this chart are slightly different than the numbers that we use, right? We're believing in 2 to 5 sets of 5 to 12 repetitions, right? Generally, NASM's going to recommend between 3 to 5 sets of 1 to 10 repetitions. 1 is obviously pretty low. That's definitely going to be more reserved for like different styles of stretch shortening. Like if you were doing like powerlifting movements, like a snatch or a hang clean, or a clean and jerk rather. I don't know why I said hang clean. But like, you know, 8 to 10 repetitions is very good for like your plyometrics. That's a great way to ensure that you're working, you know, enough time under tension, but also like enough intensity. So all of these are kind of different ways that we're going to do this, right? We've got isometric training, which can be helpful, especially in stable, if we're working for stabilization. Progressive resistance training, which is generally what we are focusing on when it comes to strength. And then we have like a lot of like plyometric training, which is going to be associated with power. So you can see kind of the 3 main things we are focusing on at, you know, in the OPT model when we're looking at like level 1, level 2, and level 3. And obviously level 2, that progressive resistance training, is really the one that we spend most of our time in, because strength is the goal of, you know, most clients coming into the gym. So if we're understanding that these are all different types of training, that's where we come back to that concept of periodization, right? So periodization isn't necessarily like a strength training technique in the sense that it affects how you lift in the gym, but it is how you organize what style of training you're primarily focusing on for certain periods of time, right? So this is a way of systematically organizing training intensities and volumes over specific periods of time, right? So it aims at lowering the time of training and increasing the intensity of training. So what they're saying there by that, right, lowering the time that you're taking to train and raising the intensity, right, this is allowing you to vary your intensities, right? So by varying the intensities, you are shortening the recovery time necessary between phases of training. And you're also like shortening how long it takes for your body to adapt. You're giving your body like continued stimulus, you know? If I were to work from stabilization into hypertrophy, into max strength, into power, and back over and over and over again, right? I'm giving myself like a different training stimulus. I'm starting with high repetitions where I need to kind of recover and build like a base. Then I'm enhancing that 1 repetition max a little bit through hypertrophy. Then I'm enhancing it a lot through max strength. And then I'm enhancing my rate of force production in power. So it's like I learn how to generate force with proper form for a month, and then I learn how to increase that force. Then I learn how to really increase that force. Then I learn how to take that force and recruit it faster before I go back and reset everything back in stabilization. And so that's sort of a way that we can kind of look at periodization there. Now, that all of that is like how we develop strength, right? Like strength is very much a concept of like increasing internal tension to overcome an external force, but it doesn't matter how fast you do it, right? Like if we're looking to develop muscular power, that is very different than just strength alone, right? Strength is definitely part of it, but it is also sort of its own concept, right? So if we're training to develop muscular power, we're focusing on rate of force production. By definition, muscular power is going to be the combined factors of speed and strength, right? So, what the heck? Factors. So it's speed times and strength, right? So we think of like power, right, as a formula. It is going to power equals force times velocity, right? And if we think of like force, that is going to be the amount of tension generated by a muscle, right? That is your strength. And then velocity is the speed of contraction. So really, like what we're focusing on here when we talk about like power is we are looking at rate of force production, right? Another way to say power. Another way to say power is rate of force production. Right? That's really what we're looking at here, right? So when you're trying to develop power, you want to definitely work on your maximal strength. Like a lot of people have trouble like developing power. Like I've talked to a lot of clients who've like tried to like learn how to dunk a basketball, for instance. And they're like, yeah, I mean, I've been doing all these jumping exercises and I've worked at it for quite some time. And it's like, the problem is you've been working the velocity side of things, right? You've been doing a lot of jumping because that is directly related to what you're trying to do, but you haven't been doing like heavy resistance training for your legs. You haven't done like force production. You've done just this velocity production, right? So if you really want to like develop power, you need to kind of attack both sides of that equation, right? So in order to maximize power output, athletes will learn how to recruit a high threshold of motor units that are, you know, comprising a higher percentage of your type 2 fibers. What they're saying there is like, you are basically looking for three main things, which I think is next. Yeah. So when it comes to developing power, so you are going to look at heavy or explosive type resistance training, okay? So what that's going to primarily focus on are three things, and this is what you are going to get. When training for maximum strength, which is phase 4 of the OPT, or power, which is phase 5 of the OPT. When you're training for both of those, we are looking for three main physiologic adaptations, right? We are training type 2X muscle fibers. So you are working on, and these are kind of the main concepts I want you guys to remember. You are going to work on motor unit recruitment, right? So a greater number of motor units will be recruited to contract as many muscle fibers as possible. So obviously we know that muscle fiber recruitment has a lot to do with strength, right? The more fibers you're recruiting, the greater your contraction is going to be. So we're definitely looking for motor unit recruitment there, right? But we are also looking for what is called rate coding, or more commonly referred to as motor unit firing rate, okay? And that is going to be motor units fire at a faster frequency, therefore creating as strong a contraction as possible. So go back to a couple days ago, we were talking about the nervous system, right? And remember how we talked about how like an action potential always fires at the same rate every single time? Like it fires at the same intensity every single time. It's the same number of millivolts, right? So how do we have like picking up a heavy barbell versus picking up like a puppy, right? Like, how do we have two different levels of strength? Well, it depends on how fast you are recruiting your motor units. So a heavy, like, or a weak contraction, right? Something that is, allowing my jaw to work right now, or something that's allowing me just to contract enough to kind of sit upright, right? That's a contraction that's really weak. That's maybe what that sounds like. My nervous system is zapping my muscle fibers at a relatively slow rate. But if we look at like what a maximal strength lift would be, right? I can't like, snap harder, right? I can't snap any harder. That's the maximal amount of sound. I can't just have like a bigger, more explosive nervous cell contraction. What I can do though, is I can fire more frequently. So I can go, right? That's a much more powerful contraction. So there's a big difference there. That's what we're talking about when we talk about rate coding. And how do you train for that? Well, you try to lift as explosively and heavily as possible. And that will result in a faster rate coding. And then now that we're talking about, and remember, there's thousands of motor units that are all firing simultaneously, right? So the last thing that kind of develops your strength is motor unit synchronization. Okay. And so like this is going to be all motor units firing in sync with each other, creating as efficient a contraction as possible. So when we're talking about like motor unit synchronization, I always like to think of this as like a tug of war, right? Because you think about like your nervous system is sort of telling your muscular system to contract, and it's all of these different fibers, right? All of these different fibers are all contracting. Actin and myosin are all reaching up and causing that shortening to occur. And so if you think about like a tug of war, right? Let's say that it was like me and a guy named Bob and another guy named Terry, and we're all like doing a tug of war, right? It's like the three of us. Let's say I'm in the front, right? And we got Bob behind me and Terry behind Bob. And so we're all pulling, right? But at some point, like we're making some progress, like we're working our way backwards during that tug of war. And I need to like reset my grip. Like my grip, it got into a weird position. My fingers are crossing over each other, and now I don't have as strong a grip, and I'm gonna lose the rope. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna like, try to continue holding with my left hand, and then like reset with my right, and then reset with my left, right? As I pull that rope closer like towards me. And that's great because now I have a better grip. The problem is like when I let go for that brief second, the overall power that was being generated by my team went down because I wasn't pulling very hard. Now, Bob, he's got to reset his grip at some point, and Terry needs to reset his grip at some point too. So if all three of us, like if I'm resetting my grip and I lose power, but then I've got a lot of power afterwards and I start pulling really, really hard, but Bob's resetting his grip behind me, we lost overall power still, because we weren't both lifting as heavy as possible at the same time. So if we were more like in sync with each other, where I'm pulling as hard as I can, at the same time Bob's pulling as hard as he can, and Terry's pulling, and we all pull at exactly the same time, we're going to have a greater power output, right? Because we're not resetting our grip. We are all playing into our strengths at the same exact time. So we have a greater overall power. And that's why you'll actually see, like, one of the best ways to win a tug of war is you put the person, the anchor at the end, you put them in charge, and they have to yell to their whole team. And you literally, if you ever want to win a tug of war, go one, and you count, you go 1, 2, 3, pull, 1, 2, 3, pull, 1, 2, 3, pull. And that way everybody pulls as hard as they can at the exact same time. Guarantee if you do that, you're going to see a much more it's much more effective than just everybody kind of going at their own, maximum effort. So that is next time you're at summer camp. So that's your motor unit synchronization there, right? So if we're training for heavy explosive training, what it's going to result in when you are doing super heavy lifting, when you are training your type 2X fibers, is it's going to be the best method for enhance your power, because again, power, a part of that is your force, right? Force production. And so synchronization or synchronous activation of motor units is going to contribute to overall power output. So motor unit synchronization is huge. And muscular power involves performing the concentric lift as rapidly as possible and the eccentric lift at normal speed. So a lot of times when you're actually doing, and they're saying normal speed here, but like a lot of times you'll even see like still pretty fast eccentric lifts. But you are trying when you're doing a heavy lift to perform it as explosively as possible. I know that it doesn't look as fast as possible, you know, like if you're picturing the last time you were on like a super heavy like barbell squat, right? You get that barbell on your back and it was like down, and then you're like, oh my God, as you like slowly try to overcome that weight, right? It may not look very fast, but you are still trying to contract very fast. And so like, you know, going fast in both those directions, that is going to help there. So that is some of our adaptations to heavy resistance training. We're going to see more motor unit recruitment. We're going to see greater rate coding, and we're going to see more motor unit synchronization. So when we're talking about like, you know, our adaptations here, we're going to see some neural adaptations as well, right? Your muscles will get stronger, but that doesn't necessarily mean they need to get bigger. This is actually why sometimes like some of the biggest, I mean, in the world of powerlifting, it's interesting. Like you'll see like Olympic weightlifters. If you look, a lot of times, like these are some of the most powerful athletes in the world, and you'll see like some not very large. I mean, like don't get me wrong, like this dude's muscular as heck. And then sometimes you'll see like very, 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 very large people as well. I think there's definitely going to be a big like blend and a big mix there. And the reason for that is like sometimes like the physics of just having a lot of weight in your upper body actually helps you throw that barbell back. So there is sort of theoretically a big benefit there. But sometimes you'll see, I mean, like these relatively smaller than you would think, like these are some of the strongest freaking people in the world performing incredible feats of strength, and they're not very large people, you know? And that's because, you know, what's strong in that individual is not necessarily the number of muscle fibers that they have, it's the efficiency of their nervous system, right? That's what's really strong. And so your muscle, there are neural adaptations. Your muscles will get stronger. They won't necessarily get bigger. And so an increase in strength is definitely dependent on your nervous system, you know? And so like, if you have like low testosterone, for instance, you may not experience like a hypertrophy of your muscles, but you might instead experience just like an increase in strength of your muscles. So there's definitely like things that are going to happen there. Now, talking about like other adaptations that we're going to experience, another one that we are going to see is hypertrophy, right? I'm in the right place. Oh, I'm not in the right place, actually. Hold on. I need a different like section header here. So muscular adaptations to resistance training. Let's go to neural real quick. Ugh. Right. So neural adaptations, right? We will see increased strength and power, but not necessarily increased size. I will also say I don't know why they don't mention it enough. They don't mention it enough here, but we'll also see increased stabilization and proprioception, right? We kind of talked about that a little bit yesterday. Now, another one that we are going to experience is hypertrophy. Okay, so hypertrophy is like an enlargement of muscle fibers, right? We'll give that its definition. Enlargement of muscle fibers as a result from increased actin and myosin proteins. So what we're going to see is an increase in the number of myofibrils per muscle cell. So remember those myofilaments that you've got, right? You've got actin and myosin there. They're making all those individual little myofibril lines. And so if you have more actin and more myosin, your muscle cell has to be larger in response to that, right? And so we are definitely going to see that as like an adaptation to strength training. And there's no avoiding it. Like your body will at some point become so efficient nervous system wise, it has to just make new fibers in order to continue getting stronger. And that's really where hypertrophy comes in. So that's why like we want to train close to failure as often as possible. Now, there are ways to enhance how much hypertrophy you create. The more you damage those actin and myosin proteins, the more your body will have like the need to repair those things. So primarily training in like a glycolysis environment, right? Training for glycolysis in particular, that's going to create a lot of lactic acid, which is very acidic. Lactic acid, right? It's very acidic, and that will actually eat away and damage those myofibrils. So your body will go, okay, well, I'm going to make more myofibrils in response to that, right? So typically, if you are training for hypertrophy, you're going to want to focus primarily on glycolysis as an energy system. And then we are going to see muscular power, right? Obviously, we're going to see that. We've already kind of talked about it. And so we will see structurally related to your tissues, like if your tissues have, like we talked about when we're looking at like power, if they have like that greater, where is it? Where to put it? All the way up here in plyometrics, right? If you enhance like that myotatic like reflex, right? If you have like tougher tendons, there is going to be a lot more power there. And also like if your body is storing more of like those creatine enzymes in order to like generate maximal ATP-PCs energy, you're going to see power, right? So when the fibers are stretched and immediately shortened, that creates like force and power. So increased power in response to the greater levels of force and utilization of stretch shortening cycles, right? So that will result in increased power. Now, this is an interesting one. This is where we have to talk really briefly about hyperplasia. So hyperplasia is something that we can experience, but it's not very common. Generally, humans, we experience hypertrophy, right? Hypertrophy is our muscle fibers that we have getting bigger, right? Hyperplasia is an increase in the number of muscle fibers, okay? It occurs in animals pretty commonly, but it occurs in humans a little less commonly, or a little less directly, rather. Resistance training doesn't do this. Like when you do resistance training, you're not making more muscle cells, you are making larger muscle cells. For the most part, your genetics kind of determine how many muscle cells you have. You want to make them, you want to look like you have more muscle, you need to make those cells bigger through hypertrophy. Hyperplasia is not really something we're going to experience as often. So I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, kind of move past that. Now, there are other things that are going to occur here, such as, again, muscle soreness, right? So we're back to talking about that DOMS, right? So muscle soreness. So I did it again. I forgot the freaking E. So muscles will experience inflammation in response to the damage caused during exercise. Okay, so you're going to experience little micro tears within your muscles, right? And so damage to myofibrils is marked most commonly in type 2 or muscle fibers, right? And the reason for that is type 2 muscle fibers primarily rely on glycolysis for energy production and therefore are burning due to lactic acid buildup. Okay, so I do want to show you really quickly a fun little video that's going to kind of explain this. It's a little TED video. By the way, this has one of my favorite phrases of all time. I'm not very big into journaling when it comes to like quoting and stuff, but man, if there's ever been like one quote that I absolutely love from a video, like you know how like people like write their favorite authors' quotes and stuff. The end of this video didn't even do it on purpose, but has like what I think is the greatest quote of all time. I'm so excited. Here we go. I love showing this video.
Muscles. We have over 600 of them. They make up between 1/3 and 1/2 of our body weight. And along with connective tissue, they bind us together, hold us up, and help us move. And whether or not bodybuilding is your hobby, muscles need your constant attention because the way you treat them on a daily basis determines whether they will wither or grow. Say you're standing in front of a door, ready to pull it open. Your brain and muscles are perfectly poised to help you achieve this goal. First, your brain sends a signal to motor neurons inside your arm. When they receive this message, they fire, causing muscles to contract and relax, which pull on the bones in your arm and generate the needed movement. The bigger the challenge becomes, the bigger the brain's signal grows, and the more motor units it rallies to help you achieve your task. But what if the door is made of solid iron? At this point, your arm muscles alone won't be able to generate enough tension to pull it open. So your brain appeals to other muscles for help. You plant your feet, tighten your belly, and tense your back, generating enough force to yank it open. Your nervous system has just leveraged the resources you already have, other muscles, to meet the demand. While all this is happening, your muscle fibers undergo another kind of cellular change. As you expose them to stress, they experience microscopic damage, which in this context is a good thing. In response, the injured cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that activate the immune system to repair the injury. This is when the muscle building magic happens. The greater the damage to the muscle tissue, the more your body will need to repair itself. The resulting cycle of damage and repair eventually makes muscles bigger and stronger as they adapt to progressively greater demands. Since our bodies have already adapted to most everyday activities, those generally don't produce enough stress to stimulate new muscle growth. So to build new muscle, a process called hypertrophy, our cells need to be exposed to higher workloads than they are used to. In fact, if you don't continuously expose your muscles to some resistance, they will shrink, a process known as muscular atrophy. In contrast, exposing the muscle to a high degree of tension, especially while the muscle is lengthening, also called an eccentric contraction, generates effective conditions for new growth. However, muscles rely on more than just activity to grow. Without proper nutrition, hormones, and rest, your body would never be able to repair damaged muscle fibers. Protein in our diet preserves muscle mass by providing the building blocks for new tissue in the form of amino acids. Adequate protein intake, along with naturally occurring hormones like insulin-like growth factor and testosterone, help shift the body into a state where tissue is repaired and grown. This vital repair process mainly occurs when we're resting, especially at night while sleeping. Gender and age affect this repair mechanism, which is why young men with more testosterone have a leg up in the muscle building game. Genetic factors also play a role in one's ability to grow muscle. Some people have more robust immune reactions to muscle damage and are better able to repair and replace damaged muscle fibers, increasing their muscle building potential. The body responds to the demands you place on it. If you tear your muscles up, eat right, rest, and repeat, you'll create the conditions to make your muscles as big and strong as possible. It is with muscles as it is with life. Meaningful growth requires challenge and stress.
How awesome is that quote at the end? It is with muscles as it is with life. Meaningful growth comes through challenge and stress. I am obsessed with that quote. I have used it in almost every graduation speech that I've ever given. Anyway, I freaking love that. But you can see like that is sort of how we experience like that's what muscle soreness is, right? It's microscopic damage, right? So we want to enhance how we create that microscopic damage. Now, this is what's kind of funny. Now, and really quickly, I want to mention something. I want to mention something here, and I want to make sure that what happens in this class does not happen is not what happened in previous classes. So so if you look at the hypertrophy tempo for most other certifications out there, you will actually see that the tempo that the other certifications use is different than NASM's. So they're still going to list it in the same. So if I go back to tempo here, they're still going to list it in the same order. Every certification uses the same order. It always goes eccentric first, isometric second, concentric third. Always, always, always. But NASM believes a 202 tempo is the key to hypertrophic growth. Like NASM believes that a 202 tempo creates the most hypertrophy. If you ask a lot of other certifications, though, they're a bigger fan of a 3-1-1 tempo. So what that means is like if I were doing bicep curls, it would be 1, pause for 1, down for 3. And what that does is that gives me a greater eccentric contraction. And we know that eccentric contractions in particular result in greater muscle soreness, which then is a sign of inflammation, which typically results in hypertrophy. So you guys can play around with that once you're out of the NASM world. Once you've got your certification, you're not worried about passing your test anymore. Try the 3-1-1 tempo. It's pretty brutal. It's where you do a lot of like negative lifts, right? So you would lift really heavy and then slow on the way down, and lift really heavy and slow on the way down. That has been associated with hypertrophy. Now, why is there a disagreement? Well, hypertrophy, it's not just about eccentric lifting, right? Although eccentric lifting creates, the theory there is that it creates a lot of like actin and myosin tears because the myosin proteins are being pulled away from the actin strands and creating this little bit of damage. NASM likes the 202 tempo because there's never a moment where you are not under like tension. So it's like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There's no pausing. So you are constantly moving actin myosin proteins. Kind of like, I was thinking of it as like pulling taffy. Like that's happening consistently. And so like there's going to be a greater lactic acid buildup. Which one is better? I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I'm brand loyal to NASM, but at the same time, I like a 3-1-1 tempo every now and then. I think it's a really good way to kind of change things up. This could be something that you could use in periodization. Like, I know some of you guys in your periodization projects kept people in hypertrophy for 2 or 3 months at a time. That's totally fine. Well, maybe you just goof with the tempo a little bit. You still keep lifting in a hypertrophy manner, but you do it by doing it at you do it by doing a 202 tempo for a month, and the next month you do a 3-1-1 tempo. It's like, hey, we're going to keep the same routine. We're just going to change the tempo slightly. That could be enough to experience like new growth and keep you from plateauing. So really quickly, I do want everybody to remember, though, you are never, ever, ever going to see 3-1-1 as a correct option on a NASM test. NASM believes 202. 3-1-1 is basically everybody else. So I had a whole class one time. It's on the final in this class that we're in. So in a couple days, I had a whole class one time put like 3-1-1 as the tempo, and I was like, "Is this a prank? Like, you guys just messing with me?" And it's because I had mentioned this. I'm only mentioning it as like information. Now, there are also some cardiovascular adaptations that come along with resistance training that are not necessarily just like strength related, right? So we'll see cardiovascular adaptations, you're going to see like what are called hemodynamic adaptations. And so these are things where like your heart rate is, for the most part, like your heart rate's not going to experience hypertrophy. It's a type 1 muscle fiber. Like it's even beyond type 1 muscle fibers. It's like a type 1 half muscle fiber. But there will be some changes in your cardiovascular system. So you'll see a heart rate will increase slightly or stay the same during strength training, right? So if your heart rate stays the same, that's a sign that your body has gotten better at like pushing more blood within like a smaller number of beats, right? So we'll also see like stroke volume and VO2 max have been shown to increase during resistance training if there is the correct type of stress. Now, I'm not saying lifting weights makes your cardiovascular system better, but doing circuit style training, which is a way of lifting weights that feels very much like cardio, is a great way to kind of tackle both things at once. So heavy powerlifting, not really going to do much for your cardiovascular system. It's just not enough time under tension. But doing circuit training is where you're just getting totally gassed, totally winded. That's a great way to see like a cardiovascular system change. And what's really cool about that is you will also see in your cardiovascular system a resistance to low density lipoproteins, because your body is going to try to, like whenever you do resistance training, your body is going to build muscle in response. And it's going to need things like testosterone to do that. And cholesterol is how we synthesize testosterone, right? Testosterone is a hormone. Your hormones are synthesized via cholesterol. That's one of the main reasons we have cholesterol. And so like when you burn up that cholesterol as a fuel source for your hormone production, that's awesome. You can trigger that through strength training. So we can see, we will see a decrease in cholesterol levels in response to strength and resistance training. So that's one of the cool things there that we will also see. Okay, so now we've talked a lot about gaining strength, but what good is it if you can't actually move? So we do also need to talk about like training to develop flexibility. So we're going to look at training to develop flexibility here. So we've looked at a lot of like the changes for like our resistance training, but we also need to talk about like how we, increase our mobility, right? So we're going to do a quick review of all of our anatomy here. So in muscles, right, we are going to see muscle spindles, which are sensory receptors sensitive to changes in muscle length and rate of length change. We'll see Golgi tendon organs, right, which are sensory receptors sensitive to changes in muscle tension and rate of tension change. And we'll see primarily joint receptors, which are sensory receptors sensitive to pressure changes and acceleration and deceleration of joints, right? So we are seeing, those are sort of like the main things that are giving our body like declaration. We're seeing, they're giving our body proprioception. Like this is how your body understands where it is. So if you look here, like this is like a muscle that eventually becomes a tendon, which would insert onto like a bone over here, right? So a muscle spindle is going to run throughout the belly of your muscle. That's how it's telling your brain like what length the muscle is. And then as that muscle becomes like a tendon and inserts onto the bone, you'll see a Golgi tendon organ, which is there to like tell the brain how much tension is in the muscle. Meanwhile, if you have like one bone connect to another one over here, you would have ligaments attaching those bones, and you have joint receptors within there that are sensing like pressure and acceleration, deceleration within the joint itself. So all of that is kind of occurring, right? And so we have a couple different ways that we train for flexibility, right? We have static stretches, which are some of our most common versions, right? This is what people tend to think of when they think of stretches, but these are slow, long duration, gentle stretches that gradually lengthen a muscle in a resting position and are held for 30 seconds up to 2 minutes. Nassim's going to tell you a minimum of 30 seconds. That's sort of one of the best ways that we use static stretches. And static stretches are going to primarily relies on autogenic inhibition to increase muscle flexibility. And so what we mean by that is like autogenic inhibition, right, is the process where pressure or tension on a Golgi tendon organ creates an inhibitory effect on muscle spindles. So muscle spindles, right, their job is to like tell your brain how long a muscle currently is, right? That's what a muscle spindle does. If your muscle spindle is overactive because you have an overactive muscle, right? Like let's say you experienced trauma at some point, right? Let's say you got hit while you're playing sports, and now like you've got an adhesion or a knot in your muscle. That muscle is going to try and stay in a shortened state so that knot doesn't get pulled apart, so that it doesn't overstretch and tear. The problem is that's reducing your range of motion, so now you're going to move the wrong way. And so we want to be able to like relax that muscle and get it back to full length and help the brain realize like what position it's supposed to be in. So autogenic inhibition can be a really effective tool for doing that. This is also going to take place during like static stretches as well. Now we're also going to see active isolated stretches. And active isolated stretches are going to be stretches that are performed by moving a muscle through its full eccentric range of motion by contracting the antagonist to that muscle, right? So you're going to contract an antagonist, and that's going to drive that muscle through its range of motion, okay? So by contracting the antagonist to a muscle, you will draw that muscle through its complete range of motion, thereby creating reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so reciprocal inhibition is a totally different process, right? Oh my God, please. I get it, my grammar sucks. So reciprocal inhibition is the process of contracting an agonist which sends an inhibitory signal to its functional antagonist, right? So when you contract your biceps, your brain will tell your triceps to relax. That's what we're doing in active isolated stretches. We are basically telling one muscle to tell its opposite muscle to shut up, right? And you're going to do this, I forgot to mention, for about 5 to 10 reps. Through its full range of motion by contracting agonist with a through its full eccentric range of motion by contracting the antagonist to that muscle for 1 to 2 seconds for 5 to 10 repetitions. Okay, so that's active isolated stretches. Now, we're also going to see dynamic stretches. And dynamic stretches are stretches that include the momentum and active muscular effort used to increase range of motion. So you're basically going to contract a muscle which will drive another muscle through its full range of motion. Now, this is not a great way to improve your actual flexibility in terms of like long-term changes, but it can be a really good way to increase your mobility temporarily. Because what it will do is it will create a series of stretch shortening cycles. So dynamic stretches actually use stretch shortening cycles to increase muscular activity. You will also see in dynamic stretches will also improve cardiac output, oxygen to muscles, and other soft tissues. So what's nice about this is dynamic stretches tend to get your heart rate up. They tend to provide a lot of blood flow to the area. They tend to really warm the body up. Now, in your traditional text, you want to perform static stretches for clients in the level 1, active stretches for clients in level 2, and dynamic stretches for clients in level 3. I actually really like to do dynamic stretches for all my clients. You know, when I'm doing like movement prep, I like to throw a few like active recovery dynamic stretches in there if my client can handle it, you know? Dynamic stretches are a great way. You know, one of the things that we avoid static stretches, one of the reasons we avoid static stretches in levels 2 and 3 of the OPT is because static stretches create an inhibitory effect on our muscles, effectively shutting them down and reducing power output. But dynamic stretches have been shown to improve our power output. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that even if you shut something down, you can turn those muscles back on through a little bit of dynamic stretching later. So that is definitely something to be aware of. Now, one more that we haven't really talked too much about, but we have also got proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or more commonly, PNF stretches, okay? And these are stretches that typically require a partner to actively stretch a participant where am I at? By some combination of alternating contraction and relaxation of both agonist and antagonist muscles. So, abomination. So when we're looking at PNF stretching, this is a really great form of stretching, guys. This is the best. And so what you're going to do is you're going to perform like several exercises that are going to, a partner will draw a muscle through its complete range of motion and hold for 20 to 30 seconds. Then instruct that partner to contract the muscle for 7 to 15 seconds. This will take this process, actually we'll look at that. PNF takes advantage of both autogenic inhibition and reciprocal inhibition simultaneously. Okay, so this is what's really great about like PNF stretches, guys, and this is how you're going to do it. You are going to move a joint to its first point of compensation, hold that for 20 to 30 seconds, then you're going to perform an isometric contraction for about 20 to 25% of your max strength, so it's nothing like too intense. You don't need to squeeze like crazy. They're saying 3 to 15 seconds here. NASM is going to say 7 to 15 seconds. Then you're going to instruct them to relax for 1 to 2 seconds. And then what you're going to do is you're going to move that limb now that it has sort of shut the muscle off even further. You're going to move it through a deeper range of motion, and you're going to repeat. This is actually a chart from your corrective exercise book that you're going to see when you guys get to Mo's class. So it should only be used on muscles that have been determined to be like overactive muscles. But basically, you can do 1 to 3 repetitions. They're going to contract for 7 to 15 seconds, and you're going to stretch for 20 to 30 seconds, set 20 to 25%. My favorite protocol is just 20 seconds on with a 10-second contraction, because then it's a nice even 30. And I'll usually do like 2 to 3 rounds of that. So it'll take either 60 seconds per stretch or 90 seconds per stretch. So what you would do is, like, if somebody was stretching me, right, they would stand behind me. They would stand behind my chair here and instruct me to take my arm up like this. And they would pull my pectoral muscle into a stretch, and they would hold that 20 to 30 seconds. Then they would instruct me to contract isometrically my chest and upper back. I'm going to create tension in the whole area. I'm going to hold that tension for about 7 to 15 seconds. And then they would instruct me to relax. And then I would stretch into a deeper range of motion. You can do this yourself. Typically it requires, like, most of them require a partner, but like if you're doing a pectoral wall stretch, you can do it by yourself. If you've got like a yoga strap for your hamstrings, you can do it for yourself. As long as you have like a small piece of equipment or something that you to push against, you can do PNF stretching by itself. I mean, even like if I were doing like my quads by myself, right? This is a, by the way, don't do this on your quads. Nobody needs this for their quads. But if I wanted to, right, I would stretch 20 to 30 seconds. Then I would squeeze 10 seconds, and then I would stretch further for another 20 to 30 seconds. So it is possible. So things to be aware of, though: contraindications. Don't do it on a muscle that has been strained or torn recently. Don't do it in anybody who has rheumatoid arthritis or any other joint disorder. And don't do it with osteoporosis. All 3 of those are contraindications. Those are clients who PNF stretching is really not safe for. So you're going to be careful with like seniors or anybody with and you want to be careful with hypertension as well. Hypertension clients, right, again, like that long duration increases tension the same way isometrics do. And we don't want to do isometrics with hypertensive clients. And that's that, guys. Yeah, I haven't got anything else for you. Do you guys have any questions, comments, concerns? How are we feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. I don't got anything.
Well, hopefully, normally, man, you know, this is another thing. Well, I'll probably just throw this into Friday. You know what? Actually, that's a good point. I should totally get in touch with Mo and see if he can come out as well. Maybe we'll do some PNF stretching on Friday as well. I want to like make Friday be kind of like a 90-minute thing, you know, in and out. But I think we'd still have time to get some of that in there. So I'm going to see if I can get in touch with Mo and see if he wants to join us. But yeah, if you guys don't have any questions, I'm going to kick you out of here for the day. We got one more. Well, we got one more lecture. Let's see here. Yeah, tomorrow we'll get our other homework out. And then Friday we'll have like our workshop, and then we'll have our final exam on Monday. So that's about it.
Okay. And I gotta turn in all my homeworks on Canvas. I haven't done it in a while.
Do it to it, man.
I'll get on it. Trust me. I'm on it today.
Yeah, I need to go through and like email folks who are running behind. A lot of people have been like, wait till test day. And I'm like, yeah.
No, I don't want to do that. All right.
Fresh. But,
I do.
Yeah. All right, man. See you later.
All righty. See you, Brad. Take it easy.
You too.